We've brought Professor Kearney here today from Boston College, where he's the Charles B. Seelig Chair of Philosophy, to talk expressly about the narrative imagination, a theme that he has worked on for many years and that enters into his 20-some-odd books in one way or another. The bulk of these books falling between the publication of his The Wake of the Imagination in 1988 and his most recent book with Columbia University Press in 2009, entitled Anatheism, Returning to God After God. For Professor Kearney, the imagination and religion have a great deal to do with one another, but I will let him tell you about that. It is then with very great pleasure that I introduce to you Professor Richard Kearney, who will speak to us on narrative imagination and catharsis.
So thank you very much, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here to talk to you today about narrative imagination and catharsis. I'm going to take three main examples to try and illustrate what I mean by the workings of narrative imagination in a healing, cathartic way. And they are namely Joyce's Ulysses, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and Homer's Odyssey. And I'm going to work through these texts, these narratives, basically testing, if you will, the hypothesis of Aristotle originally in the Poetics, that art can heal and make for better citizens, make readers into better people, more human people, by virtue of what he calls a purging, a catharsis, of pity and fear, these two fundamental, what we today might call unconscious drives or emotions, namely pity and fear, Ilias and Phobos. These emotions that, if left to their own devices, go towards extremes: pity, over-identification, fusion with others, leading to sentimentalism or irrationalism. On the other hand, Phobos, fear, which can lead to too great a distance, to the point indeed of cruelty and indifference. So the purpose of great art, for Aristotle this was tragic drama, was to try and cross these fundamental passions, pathomata, pathos, in such a way that they would be depathologized by each other. That it's a purgation of pity and fear by pity and fear. So catharsis would be fear intervening with pity to say, whoops, hang on there, stand back. And then pity intervening with fear to say, don't stand back too far. Don't go too far back. Withdraw too far back into the gods. There are people acting and suffering out there. So the interplay in sort of an equipoise of these two passions would eventually lead to what Aristotle calls catharsis, this purging or purification or distillation or balancing of the passions. The second authority, if you will, I'd like to invoke, or thinker I'd like to evoke to illustrate what I mean by catharsis, is leaping 2,500 years forward, Freud, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when he gives the example of his grandson, little Ernst Freud, who is playing with a spool of wool, and Freud happens to be babysitting and writing an article at the same time, great babysitter, while his daughter, Sophie, is out on errands. And Freud observes how his grandchild experiences profound anxiety at the loss, the absence, the disappearance. He's only 14 months of his mother. He hasn't yet spoken a word. His father is at war. It's 1915. And Freud is observing his grandson. And he watches how in the midst of this anxiety, he suddenly hits upon a spool of wool and plays with the spool back and forth, hiding it under the cloth of the crib, playpen, and then pulling it back again. And as the child, the grandchild, is playing in this way, pushing the spool forward and then pulling it back again, the first words are uttered. Fort, da. Gone, back again. Gone, back again. Of course, Freud would be there for the first child, words of his grandchild. And he would be witnessing a fit of profound anxiety, which, of course, fitted together in his analysis, his case history of his grandson, as being the reason why we play. We play in order to overcome anxiety. We play in order to fill in the gap between the abandoned self and the other who has been everything and now is nothing because the other is gone. And Freud then extrapolates from this a whole theory of trauma and how the speaking cure and by extension the writing cure can actually help to respond to profound experiences of something so horrible, so difficult, and for a child that can be the loss of a parent, the absence of a parent, that it seems intolerable, unless we can fill in the darkness, the gap, the horror, the anxiety, the pain with words. In this instance, 2 words, fort da, here, there, gone, back again, which makes this story the shortest story ever told, a story of 2 words. So let me move from the shortest story ever told to the longest short story ever told, namely Joyce's Ulysses, which actually began as a short story in 1906, November the 13th. Joyce wrote to his brother Stanislaus, back in Ireland, Joyce was in Trieste at the time, that he'd just begun a short story and that he was calling it Ulysses. And he described the genesis of the story as follows. He said, a few nights ago, I was fired from the bank where he worked, and I was coming home through the streets of Rome. It was Rome before it was not Trieste, of Rome. And as I was going home with my severance pay, I decided to have a drink. He was wont to have an odd drink on his way home in the evening. And on this particular evening, it became 2 drinks, and then 3 drinks, and then 4 drinks, and then there was very little severance pay left. Well, there was half left. And with the half, he decided to wend his way home, take a shortcut, and as he did so, he was mugged and robbed. So there he was lying, looking up at the stars, destitute, bleeding, despondent, guilty. He had a 1-year-old child, Giorgio, and the money he had was to pay the rent. And at that moment, he remembered something that he'd forgotten, which was being mugged several years previously in Dublin, on which occasion he had also been lying in the gutter outside the Abbey Theatre. And everybody ignored him as he lay there also bleeding and destitute and despondent, until a man came along, as he described it in the letter, a man called Hunter, a cuckolded Jew who picked him up and dusted him down in true Samaritan fashion, Joyce's words, and brought him home and gave him a cup of cocoa. And that, as you know, was the origin for the figure Bloom. But why the name Bloom? Because a week after this incident, as Joyce recalls it, he and Nora were given a ticket to an operetta in Rome, and they went, and the librettist for that operetta was called Blum, B-L-U-M. Joyce put the 2 events, sad and happy, together, and thereby began the shortest story ever told. The story of a father and a son, Bloom and Stephen, traversing wounds on the way to healing. I want to explain what I mean by that in a moment, but first let me just say that what I hope to address in this talk this afternoon is the possibility of a writing cure. In other words, how might art and literature help us work through pain, work through trauma? How far can narrative catharsis go, and where are its limits? And finally, how might narrative healing differ in the case of little traumas, our existential wounds of birth, life, and death, beginning with the childhood experience, first experience of loss, which for Freud is the first trauma, and then big trauma, war, violence, catastrophe. So, as I mentioned, my first example is going to be Joyce's Ulysses. Itself a story that rewrites two other stories, as we will see, Shakespeare's Hamlet and Homer's Odyssey. All three are stories of fathers and sons, stories of transgenerational trauma, which I will be suggesting are transmitted and somehow transfigured in the writing of the stories themselves. All right, let's begin then with Ulysses. In the opening of Ulysses, we're told by Hines that it's all about the father and the son idea. The son striving to be atoned with the father. And it doesn't take long for us to realize that the son is Stephen Dedalus, Telemachus, and the father is Bloom, Leopold Bloom, Ulysses. Their paths cross in the middle of the book as Stephen exits and Bloom enters the National Library in Dublin. It's a pivotal scene in which Stephen expounds his central theory of the father and the son idea in a play by Shakespeare called Hamlet. And his thesis is that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet the year his own son, Hamnet, Shakespeare's son was called Hamnet, N-E-T, died. And the same year that his father, John Shakespeare, was dying. So a son was dead, a father was dying. The play, according to Stephen Dedalus, is about the transmission of mortal trauma between fathers and sons. In short, when Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, he wrote the book of himself in order to avoid the madness of melancholy, in order to properly mourn his father and his son in a way that he was unable to do in life. The play itself thus serves as a symbolic working through of an otherwise irresolvable crisis in which a king, a father, King Hamlet, commands his son, Prince Hamlet, to do something impossible. That is, to remember something that cannot be remembered, to tell something that cannot be told, a double injunction, an unbearable burden, an impossible story, the double bind of trauma, as described by Cathy Carruth. Namely, to speak is impossible, not to speak is impossible. You all know, no doubt, the famous lines that the ghost father speaks to his son in the first act of the play, scene 5. Remember me, remember me. But that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul. It was remember me. But I can't tell you what you're to remember because I'm forbidden to do so, because I'm in purgatory for crimes committed in the days of my youth. I'm suffering in sulphurous and tormenting flames. But I cannot tell you what those crimes committed in my days of nature, my days of youth are. It is forbidden. In short, the things to be remembered cannot be told in the first place. So how is poor Hamlet to remember them, not to mention act upon them? So we're concerned here, I suggest, with traumas, unspeakable things which we do not possess, but which possess us like spectres. The play begins with a ghost. For traumas, as Cathy Carruth writes, describe by, quote, overwhelming experiences of sudden or catastrophic events in which the response to the event occurs in the often delayed and uncontrolled repetitive occurrence of hallucinations and other intrusive phenomena, end of quote. I think Hamlet perfectly qualifies. Now, if this reading of Ulysses sounds a little psychoanalytic, it's because it is. Joyce himself admitted to being deeply interested in Jung and Freud when he was, as he puts it in Finnegan's Wake, Jung and Freudened. When I was young and Freudened, I was very interested in all that stuff. And the story is well known of Freud bringing his daughter Lucia to visit Jung in Zurich, only to be told by Jung that he, Joyce, would be as incurably psychotic as his daughter if he had not penned Ulysses. In other words, his writing had saved him from madness. Writing his book of transgenerational trauma, Ulysses, Telemachus, King and Prince Hamlet, Stephen and Bloom, was, it seems, the writing cure for Joyce's own trauma. It was the book of himself. And Joyce concedes as much when he writes, "It's a brave man would invent something that never happened." There was for Joyce a link between literature and life, however unfashionable that may become in certain structuralist and formalist movements, where there was the cult of the ideology of the absolute text, and any relationship to author or reader, any hermeneutic liaison between life and literature was verboten. In any case, the thesis here, more or less, is that what happens in Ulysses happened to Joyce, at least at the level of trauma. He was, as his friend Maria Jolas remarked, a manic magpie who gleaned every word of his story from the stories of history, or what Joyce himself called the nightmares of history, the mute mothers of memory that cry out to be spoken, heard, and written. Both Hamlet and Ulysses relate such crises of narrative memory. So, Ulysses. When Stephen tells us that Hamlet is the story of Shakespeare's father-son relationship, he's echoing his relationship with his own father, Mr. Dedalus, and Bloom, his own fathers, his real historical father, Mr. Dedalus, and his surrogate spiritual father, Bloom. And this story within his story is itself a parody of Homer's original story of Ulysses and Telemachus. In other words, we're dealing here with stories within stories within stories. Fathers and sons repeating, reliving, and perhaps to some significant extent, that at least is my wager, relieving trauma up to a point. Narrative, in other words, is catharsis. But not narrative catharsis understood as closure or completion. Rather, narrative as impossible storytelling which forever fails to cure trauma, but never fails to try to heal it. And in this very effort itself, there is pleasure, the pleasurable purgation of pity and fear. Complex matters, and maybe we'll have time to come back to them. Now let's go back to the beginning. Homer's Ulysses. Now it's a standard motif of Greek myth that sons act like fathers before them, like father, like son, and so on ad infinitum, until someone says, stop. That someone is the true storyteller, the true artist, who transposes the regressive repetition of trauma in life into a cathartic repetition in narrative. Repetition backwards, which is pathological, becomes repetition forwards, which is healing. Think of the great cyclical myths, Zeus castrating Saturn, castrating Uranus. Orestes reiterating the curse of the house of Atreus, or perhaps most famously, Oedipus repeating the deeds of his father Laios. Recall, Laios raped the son of his host, Pelops, thereby committing the equivalent of incest in the betrayal of hospitality. His double transgression replicates the curse of his own father, Labdacus, and is repeated by Oedipus in the next generation. So again, the repetition of one crime after another. The continuing narrative lineage comes under the heading of the House of Labdacus and involves a recurring acting out of unspoken traumata, which of course is the Greek for wounds. Now, Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, has remarked how the three names of patrilinear descent in this story, Labdacus meaning lame, Laios meaning left-sided, Oedipus meaning swollen-footed, all refer to wounds which cause difficulties in walking. This fact, he suggests, is symptomatic of a transfer of trauma over 3 generations, and 4 if one includes Antigone and wishes to open the discussion to fathers and daughters, a very interesting thing to do. Alas, I'm not sure we will have time. But thereby hangs another tale. The only solution to this curse of cyclical repetition through 3 generations and more is the conversion of the untold wound into some form of telling. In this case, the symbolic, aesthetic emplotment of Oedipus's tragic narrative. Only this, according to Lévi-Strauss, can bring some sort of catharsis which suspends, through the purging of pity and fear, the compulsive acting out of mute trauma. The basic thesis in sum is that works of art are machines for the purging of wounds, strategies for resolving at a symbolic level what remains irresolvable at the level of our lived empirical experience. So human existence is cursed by a tragic because impossible desire to escape the trauma of our autochthonous earthly origins. This is Levi-Strauss's basic thesis. Namely, the desire to buck our finitude, to deny death. In the Oedipus cycle, this tragic curse is epitomized, as noted, by the patrilinear names for wounds that bind us to the earth. We're hobbled, we're lame, of our Achilles heel, if you will. And the poetic role of mythos mimesis, that imitation, creative imitation and emplopment, that comprises tragic art for Aristotle, is to narrate our heroic desires to transcend our terrestrial nature. So, for example, in Oedipus Rex, Cadmus kills the dragon, Oedipus defeats the Sphinx. But our desires are ultimately impossible. We are scarred by contrary and irreconcilable fidelities to earth and to sky, to immanence and to transcendence, finitude and infinity, matter and spirit, nature and culture. All the binaries of culture and nature are replicated in a way that can never be fully resolved. We are split beings. We are who we are not, and we are not who we are, as Jean-Paul Sartre puts it. But already in Greek myth, these contraries, these binary opposites, were being played against each other in a cathartic way to bring about some sort of equipoise at a fictional, aesthetic, symbolic level, mythic level, that could not be brought about at an existential, lived level. For Levi-Strauss, in short, great mythic narratives are attempts to procure cathartic relief by balancing the binary opposites in symbolic constellations. In a word, what is impossible in reality becomes possible in fiction. So how might this reading relate to the story of Ulysses and Telemachus, the Homeric story of father and son? Let me say a word about Homer's version and then return to Joyce's. Ulysses, in Homer, is condemned to act out the wound of his own failure, his own existential finitude again and again. He has absented himself from the wounds of his birth and upbringing, his autochthonous origins in Ithaca, sailing off to heroic glory. But his attempts to become an immortal warrior are constantly countered by reminders of his mortality, the brutal carnage of Troy and subsequent calamities. Originally leaving Ithaca as an aspirant hero, Ulysses returns as a beggar, a lowly outcast only recognized by the smell of his flesh by his dog Argos and the scar on his thigh by his nurse Euryclea. It's significant that Euryclea only touches her master's scar after a very detailed narrative, 22 lines, about how Ulysses received the original wound in a childhood hunting incident with his grandfather, Autolycus. Yet another example of transgenerational and forgotten trauma. Telemachus, expecting a triumphant victor to return, does not at first recognize Ulysses. He is so fixated on his great expectations of the father that he does not see the scar on his body. He's blinded by illusory images. When he finally acknowledges that the mortified stranger before him is in fact his real father, they sit down together and eat. Sharing simple food of the earth, squatting in a swineherd's den, is how they finally come together as host and guest. Hospitality as antidote to the hostile curse of fate, ate. The word Homer uses for scar here is ulin. That's Odyssey, book 19. This is a term often associated in Greek literature with trauma, as in Plato's Gorgias, ules ento somati hypotraumaton, where ulin means both trace and scar. While the wound is timeless, the scar appears in time. It is a carnal trace which can change and alter over time, though it never disappears. There's no cure, but there may be a healing of the scar. You can't cure the wound, but the scar may help in the healing. Scars are written on the body. They are forms of proto-writing. Narrative catharsis, then, would be a way of working through such carnal traces, or to put it in another way, while the trauma remains timeless and unrepresentable and incurable, scars are the marks left on the flesh to be seen, touched, told, and read. Scars are engraved wounds that may or may not be healed. Now, if we have time, I shall return to this crucial question, crucial distinction between wounds and scars. But let's proceed. How, in the light of all this, does Homer's epic compare with Joyce's parody? Quite apart from the fact that we've leaped 3,000 years, the father-son idea repeats itself. But the repetition is once again forward, not backward. That is what art can do, give a future to the past. Joyce's narrative invites a release from the haunting cycle of trauma. The story of Stephen and Bloom recounts their respective efforts to escape the loss of absent fathers, Stephen's, and absent sons, Bloom's early departed child, Rudy. They both seek a new bond of spiritual paternity, filiality, but they cannot find it for as long as they remain captive to their respective illusions of what this should be. Stephen's fantasy of a perfect fusion and Bloom's obsession with his lost son. Only when they accept their condition of wounded finite beings, Stephen breaking with the literary elite of Dublin, Bloom returning home to Molly with, as we're told, less envy than equanimity, less jealousy than abnegation. Only then can arise a love beyond illusion. Surrogate father and surrogate son, Bloom and Stephen, exchange stories of failure and mourn lost illusions. Such love beyond loss is only a hint, of course, a glint in Molly's matinal eye. But enough of a narrative catharsis nonetheless to give the reader hope in another day, in beginning again. To quote Joyce, child man weary, man-child in the womb. So to return one last time to Hamlet, we might ask this. Why does Stephen Dedalus choose this particular story, Shakespeare's play, to work out his own theory of the father-son idea? Let's take a closer look at Shakespeare's play. The ghost of King Hamlet asks his son to remember something that cannot be remembered. So, as we noted already, the play begins with a tale that cannot be told, a testimony that cannot be transmitted, thereby breaking with the age-old sacred tradition of deathbed blessings passed from fathers to sons. Think of the famous history plays, for instance, by Shakespeare. This breakage is an example, this breakage between father and son, is an example of what Dory Laub calls the collapse of witnessing. Dory Laub is a famous writer on Holocaust traumas and testimonies. Hamlet, we saw, knows his father is condemned to flames for a secret sin committed in his youth. But his father is forbidden by this very same sin to say what this is, that is, from telling his story. So Hamlet inherits a double injunction, as we mentioned, remember, don't remember. Here, as in many ancient narratives of trauma, blind acts of murder and incest are encrypted rather than confessed. Whence the inheritance of the wound as a mark in one's flesh, what Hamlet famously calls the mole of nature, which one inherits with one's birth. Hamlet spends the entire play trying to catch the conscience of the king, as he puts it, deploying the antique disposition of mask and subterfuge, play, pun, and quip, so that he might, by indirection, find direction out. So that he might perform a play within a play, a form of art that would expose the truth. But working through takes time, patience, a full 5 acts. Truth only ultimately reveals itself when Hamlet succeeds in abandoning his illusions about a perfect father. Look here upon this picture and on this, as he taunts his mother, saying, look at my perfect father who's dead, and this foul villain Claudius who has replaced him. Only when he gives up his illusion about his perfect father and accepts that he, no less than his father before him, is a failed, forked, mortal, finite thing, can he act. Can he say, eventually, the readiness is all, let be. And this fundamental conversion scene comes in the grave diggers scene, as we will note. So the climax comes when Hamlet comes to realize that his real father, the one who loved him as a child and bore him daily on his shoulders, was not, as he'd always imagined, his natural father, King Hamlet, who fought a duel and committed an act, in fact a criminal act, against King Fortinbras the day that Hamlet was born. It wasn't that father who had looked after him, but the long-buried court fool, poor Yorick, who he rediscovers in the graveyard scene. Only then is Hamlet the son ready to act according to something beyond himself, what he calls a divinity that shapes his ends, acknowledging his own mortal condition. After he has held the skull of Yorick in his hand. Remember, he has never seen the dead body of his father. not to mention his skull. He never saw his corpse. He was not there for the funeral. He was in Wittenberg, and the body was buried before he returned. Why? Because his father had been poisoned. The body had prematurely putrefied and had to be buried with unseemly haste, as he puts it. So Hamlet the son dies, the plays hints, poisoned by the same sword that Hamlet the father had used to poison King Fortinbras on the day Hamlet was born. And to follow this hint, it was this secret poisoning which led to the cycle of further killings of kings by kings, Fortinbras, Hamlet, Claudius, and of sons by sons, Hamlet, Laertes, and almost Fortinbras the son. But Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, has put an end to that. This fatal circle of repetition only comes to an end when Hamlet himself becomes the sacrificial symptom of cyclical acting out and exposes the wound in his own body where the sword entered. Note that the fatal wounds of King Hamlet's body were never seen or touched by his son as scars, precisely because, as I mentioned, the poisoned king was to his grave untimely sent, interred without ceremony before Hamlet had time to return and witness the funeral. In other words, the wounds of the father were never witnessed as scars by the son. Once again, a collapse of witnessing, which makes for traumatic delay. Hamlet's endless procrastination. Traumas are revisited as ghosts again and again throughout the play, coming back again and again after the event, revenant après coup, Freud's Nachträglichkeit. And revenant, as you know in French, means what comes back. The ghost is a revenant, which keeps coming back. So let me sum up. Because the son did not witness the father going down into his grave, this absence was engraved in his flesh. The loss, the lack, the gap of the empty grave, the missingness, all this was encrypted as a suppressed right of memory, waiting 5 full acts of procrastination to be retrieved. This is perhaps the reason why T.S. Eliot described Hamlet as an artistic failure, if also the most written about drama in Western culture. And it's also the reason why Andre Green describes Hamlet as the greatest literary reenactment of unconscious trauma and recovery, to which psychoanalysts have been endlessly drawn like kittens to a ball of wool. In short, fathers and sons, sons and fathers. Eventually, it's Hamlet's own sacrificial surrender which enables the play's other fatherless son, Prince Fortinbras, to live on, to survive the fatal curse which ghosted the whole revenge cycle for generations. And remember, Shakespeare took a revenge cycle and a history play, and he put them together and transformed them artistically into a tragic drama, where the catharsis performed in the drama enables the release, the cathartic release from that fatal acting out, repetitive and obsessional acting out of violence. So the story that could not be told is finally told, though it takes 5 acts. Hamlet's dying words to Horatio say it all: absent thee from felicity a while to tell my story. And the closing words of the 5th act are delivered by Fortinbras himself, finally set free by Hamlet's sacrifice, to recover the crypted memory of his own father. He says, I have certain rights of memory to this kingdom, which now to claim advantage doth invite me. He is able to respond to his father's call, remember me. Memory and story therefore cross in mourning. And if there is catharsis for us, the audience, it is indeed a purging of pity and fear. So in the few minutes remaining, I would like to say something about how there may be limits to narrative catharsis. How far can we go? And at what point do we simply have to acknowledge that there are some traumas that can never be narratively healed by art of any kind? So, I would suggest, in closing, that we need to think about the genuinely cathartic role of trauma stories as requiring open narratives that never end, rather than closed narratives that presume to wish away wounds rather than working through scars. Trauma narratives are by their very nature truncated, gapped, fractured, inconclusive. They may be great stories, but they can never offer terminal solutions or total cures. Writing can only work through traumas as traces, revisited as hauntings. They can never fully retrieve experiences or tell the full story, fill in all the gaps. In the transposition from inexpressible wound to written scar, there's something always lost in translation, invariably, because the wound is precisely that which could never be properly registered or recorded in the first place. It was because it was too much that trauma repeats itself as lack. Trauma narratives are scabs over the cavities left by inexperienced experience. And that's what trauma is. It's inexperienced experience. It's experience that is too intolerable, too unbearable to be registered. So it leaves an open wound. And the work of art, of myth, of story, is in that instance to try to convert the open wound into a scar that can be worked with, if never finally cured. So recall in conclusion, in the light of this final hypothesis, are three stories. The trauma inherited by Hamlet, namely his father's murdered by Claudius and his father's secret sin, ostensibly committed on the day Hamlet was born, is something hinted at in the play. It is never openly stated. Moreover, the fact that his father's death and burial are missed by Hamlet, who was away in Wittenberg, is a further token of inexperienced experience, linked in its own murky way with Hamlet's mother's incestuous liaison with Claudius. Hinted at but never seen. Secrets, there are secrets everywhere, cryptings and decryptings, plays within plays. Shakespeare's drama engraves traces of buried trauma, which Hamlet resolves to exhume as in the gravedigger's scene, but never finally exposes. Many bodies are rotten and rotting in the state of Denmark, from its eponymous king to the disappeared Polonius. But they're all hidden away, behind walls and wainscotings, lies and disguises, screens and seams. I know not seams, madam, says Hamlet to his mother. All we have are odours, ashes, allusions, oblique ciphers less deciphered than played with like spools of wool or gallows wit around a graveyard, and played out in imitated suffering and action. In this sense, the play's very success is its failure. Hamlet's manic, melancholic words swarm like bees over the black hole of an empty hive, but they can never fill in the gaping wound. They can only at best conjure and confront the invisible ghosts within. The narrative catharsis comes ultimately not from the cognition of discovery. We never know what actually happened, but a curiously liberating recognition of recovery, as in the recovery of the skull, the trace, the scar of Yorick. Failing to gain full knowledge of his father's unspoken crime, Hamlet nonetheless comes to acknowledge the limits of his own finitude, of his own humble existence, his crucial lesson in the grave scene. Indeed, the fact that King Hamlet's hidden story, the real reason he is condemned to purgatory, remains buried throughout the play, only returning as spectral intimations, itself performs Prince Hamlet's inability to discover his own story, and by extension, our inability as an audience, as readers, to discover the unfathomable story of the play. Hamlet is a tragedy of trauma. It recounts the impossibility of saying the impossible, and yet it gives pleasure, and it performs a catharsis. It heals. Similar issues of unsayability surround the unspoken traumas of Stephen, Daedalus, and Odysseus, the other two heroes of our other two stories. There are signs here too, but they are equally cryptid. Stephen's overdetermined guilt, again bite of inwit coming back and again to haunt him. Odysseus's occluded scar, which remains concealed and hidden up until the very last scene of the epic. And we as readers may in turn hypothesize about the nature of the various authors' own engraved wounds. For instance, what Homeric trauma lies behind the late, long-forgotten story of Odysseus' infantile wound? It may be a personal trauma, it may be a collective trauma. We don't know. We don't have to know. It's left unsaid, but the story is an attempt to work through that unsayable wound. How deep was Shakespeare's shame, for instance, at missing his own son's funeral, which he did, currying favour with a barbarous queen, Elizabeth, which he did, abandoning his own father's forbidden Catholicism, which he did, And to give Joyce the last word, what traumas, little or big, may have been reactivated by his incidental mugging in a Roman street? Guilt at abandoning his mother and family, the painful break with his native city and culture, or perhaps farther back still, the untold historical rupture inherited from the Great Irish Famine with its extinctions, evictions, and exiles. And you in this country, as much as we in Ireland, have lived with some of the consequences of those forgotten memories of the famine. Let me conclude that final paragraph with a few words about the importance, I think, of the unspoken famine story as the ultimate historical trauma for Joyce in Ulysses. This last transgenerational wound is rarely acknowledged in Joyce studies, and this itself is arguably a symptom of the elusive nature of the trauma. But for all its neglect, it is, I suspect, a key aspect of Joyce's native unconscious. Joyce himself was born in 1882, less than 30 years after the Great Hunger, that split Ireland into pre- and post-famine histories, witnessing 1 million dead and another 1 million plus banished, almost a third of the population between 1847 and 1852, many of whom came, of course, to Groseil and the Bay of Lawrence, where countless died. On one particular day, there was a record of 42 ships lined up to the south of Groseil, and of the ships, less than 10% of people lived, and of those who came ashore, only 2% were finally allowed onto the mainland because of disease. That was a bad day, but it says something. Joyce's father and grandfather lived through this unspeakable horror, though like most witnesses who survived at home or abroad, the pain of an droch sail, or bad times as they were literally known in Irish, went unwritten and largely unremembered. So if Stephen vows at the end of a portrait to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race, is it not logical that this great wound in the national psyche would return in Joyce's next novel, Ulysses, as some kind of irrepressible haunting? An untold tale demanding to be heard. This is, I submit, precisely what happens. The references are oblique, but they are pervasive, as Luke Gibbons and other critics have recently shown. From Stephen's dead mother's phantasmal returns, to her ghost constantly returns to haunt Stephen, to Bloom's frequent allusions to hunger, soup kitchens, and potatoes. He even carries a potato in his pocket as a talisman. You don't know whose thoughts you're chewing on, muses Bloom. Famished ghosts. Ah, I'm hungry. Or as the daughters of Aaron, also called the daughters of memory, sing in the Circe episode of Ulysses, I quote, "Potato, preservative against plague and pestilence, pray for us." The allusions are multiple if characteristically muted. Much hermeneutic digging is required, here as in Hamlet's graveyard, or Odysseus' forgotten childhood. Wounded authors call for readers, traces for interpretations, hints for guesses, ciphers for thoughts. In sum, Joyce's narrative of his native psyche shows that past wounds are never completely past, no matter how much one prays. The psychic palimpsest of personal and historical abandonments finds expression in the ineradicable wounds of what Stephen calls banishment from the heart, banishment from the home, anticipating here the great emigrations that followed from the Great Famine. Joyce identified similar experiences of sundering in both Shakespeare and Homer, whose traumatized heroes also carry ineradicable scars of exile and injury. Like his literary predecessors before him, Joyce grafted stories onto hidden histories, forgotten histories, repressed, occulted, stolen. His narratives are secreted from those nightmares of history which, by his own admission, make Joyce's writing the last word in stolen telling. Ulysses is, I wager, a tireless literary effort to awaken cathartically from such historic nightmares by restoring forfeited stories and bringing ghosts back to life. It is, in short, a work of mourning and recovery, a writing which translates wounds into scars, flesh into fiction, a working through of trauma. Thank you.